Let me introduce tonight's discussion. We are delighted to have the influential and well-respected journalist and correspondent for The Atlantic, James Fallows. Mr. Fallows has reported extensively from inside and outside the United States. He has lived and worked in Asia, including Tokyo, Kuala Lumpur, Shanghai, and Beijing for 8 years. Mr. Fallows has 10 books to his credit. His latest book is China Airborne. In China Airborne, Mr. Fallows uses China's aerospace industry as a metaphor for the Chinese economy today and looking to China's future and what it means for the rest of the world. But let me add something that is much closer to home for us. Almost a year ago, Mr. Fallows and his wife, Deborah, a linguist and an author, began a journey to visit small towns across America, flying the airplane piloted by Jim, spending time in towns and cities that mainstream news coverage have overlooked. When the project is done, they intend to have a report that showcases the people, communities, companies, and trends that are emerging out of the past decade's economic, technological, and demographic challenges. And the very first small town they visited was Holland, Michigan. Perhaps Mr. Fallows will give us a quick update on that project and tell us the last small town they have visited. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our very special guest, Mr. James Fallows. Speaking on the topic, is China opening up or closing down? So now let's give a very warm welcome to Mr. Fallows.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ping, for your gracious introduction. Thank you all for having me here. Thank you for this set. I feel like a televangelist. So I'm going to be asking you to either come to a certain religion or give me money at the end of this presentation. But it's I feel I will take this stage with me wherever I go from now on, talking to my sons. Listen, boys. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I've been a big fan of World Affairs Councils around the country, and I've spoken at many of them. I was one in Jacksonville, Florida, a week or two ago, and that was a very different setting from here, but same kind of ambiance and topic. I'm a fan of the Great Decisions series, which I've paid attention to, and I respect very much the way you focus people in communities like this on affairs around the world. And this is the extra voice of God I'm trying to give you from the stage here, that you connect community leaders with rising leaders from college students. So those of you who are in college or graduate school, thanks for coming too. I also wanted to thank personally the sponsors for this evening's event, the Padnoses, Jeff and Peg. We first met each other when we were all undergraduates in college many, many years ago. Not so long ago for Peg as for Jeff and me, but I can also just try to project if you'd like. Shall we try that? Okay. So Jeff and Peg have been, as you know, very, very influential members of the community here in Western Michigan and in Holland. My wife Deb and I had known about this, but we hadn't seen it in person till we were here last summer as the kickoff stop on our flying journey around the country. It's a project called American Futures, which we at The Atlantic are doing in partnership with Marketplace Radio, so we do broadcasts from place to place. And one of the themes that most impressed us from Holland and from seeing the Padnoses effort there and many other civic leaders is the difference it made for communities to have locally based and locally conscious wealth of people who felt their past was in the community, their future was in the community, and that they existed for reasons more than just quarterly profit and maximizing efficiency, but the welfare of their state, their community, their region was important to them. So we saw that very vividly in the city of Holland. It was interesting too, and we may get to this in questions, after I'd published 5 or 6 dispatches saying, here are things interesting that have happened in Western Michigan and that I haven't seen in other places. I heard a contrary view from people who, for one reason or another, had decided to leave small communities around here and the constraints they'd felt in different ways. So it's a sign that there's no part of America that is perfectly Norman Rockwellish. It's a matter of looking for the goods and bads around the country, but we certainly saw the goods here, and I was very glad to have an opportunity to come back here. So thank you, Jeff and Peg, for what you've done for your community over the decades, for what you did for my family last summer, and what you're doing for this community this evening and other times. So the question that I propose to at least suggest to you, as opposed actually to answer this evening, is how we think about China. Should we view it as being opening up or closing down? The background I bring to this is that I first was in China with my family back in the mid-1980s when we were then living in Japan. Our kids were then little. My wife was then and now working as a linguist. I was working as a journalist, and we first were in China in the mid-80s. We've been back and forth there many times in the interim. We started living there in 2006, and were there most of the time until 2010, and we've been trying just to explain to a Western and Chinese readership how to think about the dynamism in that part of the world. And one way to think about the unanswerable question of where China is going is, on balance, do we think things are getting more open or less open there in the foreseeable future? I'm going to give you one spoiler. The answer I'm going to give you to this question is, it depends. It depends on how you define openness or closedness. I'm going to give you another spoiler too, and that spoiler is going to be, no one knows. Even after you say it depends, still nobody really knows how to judge the trends I'm going to be laying out for you. And a third spoiler, and I hope you still will listen for the next few minutes, but this is the spoiler. Third spoiler is, probably both things are true at once. Probably, we don't know, it depends, and things are getting open in certain ways and closed in other ways, and so therefore the exercise is thinking how we think about this question of what is the framework we apply to news coming out of China, personal experiences we have there, dispatches, rumors, business experiences, and all the rest. And that's what I'm going to try to provide for you. The way that I think about thinking about these questions, the framework I apply as each day's news emerges, because any answer I would give you today on the last day of March in 2014 might be different a month from now, or 6 months from now, or a year from now, but the framework we apply, I think, can stand up over some period of time. First, I wanted to do a poll of people's experiences here, just so we have a sense of each other and of the backgrounds that we apply. First, everybody here who has been to China at some point, I assume that's a fair number of people in this part of the world, people who have been there who've been places other than the big East Coast cities, not Shanghai, not Beijing, Guangzhou, but into the interior of the country. People who have been there for more than a total of, let's say, 6 months in China. So people who have a significant experience. People who have done business there, probably a number of people. Anybody who was born in China, I bet and hope there'll be some here. Now I just wanted to get a sense of basic starting attitudes about China. The first question is going to be the two choices. On the whole, are you afraid of China, however you want to define that, or are you not afraid of China? So are you in some way afraid of China and what it means for the world? And people who, on the whole, are not afraid of China and what it means for the world. Interesting. The two polls here will be, on the whole, are the US and China destined to collide or not? I don't necessarily mean World War I type clash of the rising powers, but in some way, is this likely to be the next big geostrategic struggle the US has? On the whole, the US and China are destined to collide, people who think that, and those who think, on the whole, destined not to collide. Interesting. How many people here are considering studying Chinese language? Those people and everybody else should buy my wife's book, Dreaming in Chinese. It's a great book. It's about what she learned about China by learning the Chinese language. How many people here, the choice is going to be, Do you think you should study Chinese because it's the language of the future or because it's basically interesting? How many people think language of the future? And those who think it's basically interesting. And the answer, of course, is some combination of all of the above. So thank you for that poll. The way I'm going to set up this framework of addressing the question of is China opening or closing or almost any other question you might want to ask about China is to have, there are basically 4 questions I'm always rolling over in my mind as I think about China. I'm going to give you a brief description of each one of those questions and then what they lead me to think about China now. The first one of these questions is, what does China want? Now, obviously, that's a ridiculous question, and I'll explain why there's some non-ridiculous aspects about it. But if we think about what are all the various components of the Chinese mass now, what are they striving toward, what direction are they trying to reach? That's the first question I have. I'll give you one other Padnos-related trip down memory lane to show the importance of the difficulty of knowing what's happening in China, but also the importance of trying to triangulate it. Way back in the late 1960s, when Jeff and Peg and I were all freshmen in college, I had come from a small town in Southern California. They'd come from their various origins, including Holland. We went to a mandatory freshman lecture in this gigantic memorial hall, which was many times bigger than this, although the podium was not as impressive for the speaker. And one of the speakers we listened to was a man named John King Fairbank, who some of you may have heard of. He was then one of the great experts in China studies. He'd been raised in China as a missionary's child and has written many books. And he was saying, this was in the fall of 1966, that something mysterious is going on in China and we don't know what it is. Now, this is a person who was one of the world's experts on China from the outside, but he said, we're getting reports from different parts of China of things going on there which seem different from before, and if our reports are true, this will be something very important. Of course, he was talking about the first inklings of the Cultural Revolution. This was what transformed China for the next almost decade. You had, in some cases, 5,000 years worth of history being uprooted, many people suffering very badly. My point is that one of the world's experts in China then was suggesting the tentativeness of knowing what was going on there as one of history's huge events was going on. And he tried to say, here are ways to keep your eye on understanding what's going on in this great continent. I do not presume to anything like his augustness, but that's the effect I'm going to try to have of saying, here are markers to lay down as we look for news that's going on. Now let's think about those 4 questions I suggested and how we can approximate the answers to them. Now, of course, on the first question of what does China want, there's no answer because China is a million zillion different things, even more than the US. It's a diversity of interests. Here's one scale point that I mention in my recent book, China Airborne, that I think is worth bearing in mind in trying to approximate the different interests going on in China. We all know that China has a scale of humanity that differs from that in the United States, but here's a way to envision it. The arable land within China is about equal to the United States east of the Mississippi. That's about how much arable land they have. The entire landmass is about like the continental United States, but most of it's desert and mountain. So you're starting with east of the Mississippi for China to work with, and in that they have all the population of course, the US, plus Canada, plus Mexico, plus the Caribbean, plus Brazil, plus Argentina, plus everything else in the Americas, plus Nigeria, plus Japan, all in east of the Mississippi. And so there are differences of interest, there are constraints on resources. One of the first things I heard from a Chinese bureaucrat when I moved there in 2006 is he said, everybody outside China tends to think of things here as multiplied by 1.3 billion. We think of them as divided by 1.3 billion when you're talking about resources or opportunity or anything else. But as we try to think about gradations within this huge country, I'll suggest just a couple of slices. If we think about Chinese individuals in their billion-plus number and Chinese families, I think what they want of the foreseeable future is something very obvious and non-mysterious to the rest of the world. They would like a better life. They would like more opportunities, more security, healthcare, less pollution, and all the rest. The reason this is significant is I often felt in China that the baseline experience there was sort of like the baseline experience now most familiar from shows like Mad Men, or showing the immediate post-World War II, post-Korean War episode in the United States, where the previous 50 years had been so tumultuous for so many people that simply having a home, having a job, raising your kids was a reasonable ambition for people. In China, the living experience of people who are 80 years old is completely traumatic. They've been through starvation, civil war, occupation, all the rest. People who are my generation, the hated baby boomers, they've been through all sorts of things in China: the Cultural Revolution, the starvation of the years in the 1950s, the struggle of the past 20 or 30 years. Their children have seen a steadily rising standard of income. And so until, say, 4 or 5 years ago, the memory of most people in China was life was dramatically better than 20 years ago, pretty clearly better than 5 or 6 years ago. And the question is, would that trajectory continue? And so I'll just lay down the marker that for most people in China, the question is life simply getting better in ways anybody here would recognize, of your hopes for your children and all the rest? This is one reason, and I'm going to make this point 8 or 10 times, this will be the first, why the environment is the major political issue in China from my point of view, because it's the main threat to this rising standard of living for people. If you are having epidemics of birth defects, if you are having something previously unknown in the world, lung cancer epidemics among children, if you're having farmers who can't raise their crops, this is a really destabilizing thing for the regime as a whole. So this is, we often will hear these sort of bromides in the press: the Chinese economy needs to grow at X% to have stability. I convert this to, this is like any other society where people are finally having a better life, and that, from individuals and families' point of view, that's their expectation, that's what they would want. From the point of view of companies and businesses in China, I think there's something different they want, different both from just continuation and different from what we think here, what the outside world mainly thinks. My impression, although I've tried hard to beat this down in the Atlantic articles and books, is that the outside world's impression of China, until fairly recently, has been this unstoppable locomotive that just will achieve anything at once economically, and there will be the China price and the China miracle, and et cetera. And it certainly is true that there is scale in China and ingenuity and effort and effervescence and all those things. But I think if this were a gathering in a counterpart area to Western Michigan in China, that is a manufacturing area that prided itself on world markets, the concern among your counterparts there would be whether the Chinese economic model could change from what it's been before. And here's the short version of what I mean. The long version is the point of my book, China Airborne. The short version is, over the last 30 years, the Chinese economy has accomplished something that took England and Germany and the US a couple of hundred years. And that's bringing a whole lot of people from rural peasantry to Dickensian low-wage manufacturing life. And so this was something that was through the mill era for New England in the 1820s, and then on through the great Midwestern factory cities in the 1870s and 1880s. That's been compressed in a very, very short period in China, and it's a tremendous achievement that you have hundreds of millions of people who've gone from very tough farming lives to having some purchase on the modern world. And that is, I think, the reason that nobody can underestimate the achievement of the government there, is they have pulled this off. However, I think many people who are economic leaders in China wonder whether the easy part is now over, and whether 20 or 30 years from now, the question is whether they will be just a bigger version of what they are now, that is a kind of subcontracting a shop for the rest of the world, or whether it will become a genuinely rich economy in the model of Japan or South Korea or European economies or the United States. So excuse me a moment. And I'll give you a prop to demonstrate how they think about this. I hold in my hand an iPad. Many of you have held these in your hands. I've seen the place where all these things are made in China. What's interesting about the iPad and similar electronics, and understood by economic leaders in China, is that If this cost $500, only 50 of that 500 stays anywhere in China, even though it's made in China. The rest goes to Apple, and it goes to the glass makers who are American, and it goes to Japanese chip makers, and it goes to your retailer, it goes to FedEx, and it goes to all these other places, not to anybody in China. And that's because the profits in international commerce these days are for the global corporations whose names you know, from Siemens to Disney to Google to Apple, and China doesn't have these. It doesn't have any. I mean, you can think of 20 of them from Korea and 100 from Japan. And in China, you can think of Qingdao Beer, you can think of Haier, making sort of the white goods, you can think of big state-owned enterprises, but the sort of modern global corporation, which it underscores the wealth of Europe and Japan and South Korea and North America, is something that China does not have. And the question is whether within their current economic and political model they can develop it. That's a whole different debate, which I won't get into now. I'll simply say, from the company's point of view, if families want things to continue, what companies want is for things to get different, and for a different kind of economic model, not just sort of pulling the country out of farming, but bringing it to the ranks of the South Koreas and the Japans and the United States, whether that's possible. A side note here, I'm sure you've seen some of the stories that at some point China will overtake the United States as the largest economy. It's worth recognizing that means that China will be only 1/4 as rich as the US per capita when that happens, because of 4 times as many people. There is a very large gap still to be made up. To shift to the next component of what China might want, let's think about the government. The Communist Party, which has been in charge since 1949, and which has been celebrating its anniversaries. What does the government want? I think the government wants one thing similar to all other governments, but different. Similar to all other governments, it wants to remain in power. Different from all other governments in that in the United States, in Europe, in democratic countries, any individual political party, its hold on power is always tenuous. The Democrats want to hold the White House, the Republicans want to hold the House, but the underlying validity of the government is not really in question. I think in China, because it's not democratic at the national level, the legitimacy of the government itself is very closely connected to the sort of security of the party. And without giving you the whole argument now, I think there is very serious awareness on the part of political leaders in China about that they need to keep moving quickly to make sure they actually stay in control. It's not a settled issue. I'll give you two illustrations here that are worth mentioning. My friend Susan Shirk is a professor of Chinese studies at UC San Diego. She wrote a book a couple of years ago called China, the Fragile Superpower. She said that when she gives talks in America or in Europe, the question is always, what do you mean fragile? When she gives talks in China, the question is, what do you mean superpower? Because people there are aware of the vulnerabilities of the government, of the country as a whole, of the economic system. I think that if you look at many of the decisions of the Chinese government from the lens of an organization that feels actually insecure rather than arrogant or super secure, there's often a clearer connection between that sensation and decisions they make on opening up and closing down than acting out of super confidence. There's one other analogy here. The model that most stays in my mind for thinking about the government and the way they can navigate these rapids is literally navigating rapids. I think of the government over the last 60 plus years as being a skillful boatful, a boat going down a category, whatever a high category rapids is, and the last moment avoiding one boulder after another. They ran into a boulder at Tiananmen Square, but pretty much they've avoided the rest. And so because they have a 60-year record of avoiding these boulders, especially the last 30 years, you think, well, you give them the benefit of the doubt, but there are a lot of boulders ahead, and they're more aware of that than not. The last element of the Chinese, what do they want, is sort of the grandeur of nation-state China as a whole. I think there's an assumption in the outside world that China wants some kind of preeminence on the world stage to match its economic power. I think, I'll just assert, I think that is a much stronger impression from outside the country than from inside. I once was talking with somebody who was an English person who was saying he thinks the Chinese leadership wakes up each morning imagining how they can settle scores with the rest of the world and take their rightful place. I think the Chinese leadership wakes up each morning thinking, how can they get through the day? How can they avoid the whack-a-mole series of challenges they have had? That is the first and very, very longest of the questions I'm going to ask. What does China want? Individuals want the same. Businesses want something different. The government wants to survive. And the nation state also wants to survive and get through the day. Let's look quickly now, much more quickly, at the second question of, are they likely to get it? If we define success in these terms, what are the odds of each of the groups getting them? On the first, for people and their families, it's becoming a more mixed perspective than it was 4 or 5 years ago. When you read stories about inflation being a concern in China, that matters here because people have one of their main saving vehicles is housing there, and housing is ramping up to a high level. The flight of money out of China, both from the very rich elite and from people at a less elite level but still have the opportunity to export money, that's a sign of nervousness about being able to realize these ambitions within China, the protests within the countryside, and above all, the environmental crisis. I think these are indicators of whether individuals and their families are feeling hopeful or less hopeful about their being able to continue over the next decade or two the success their country has had in recent years. Here is a marker to bear in mind, too. You know that the president of China over the last year plus has been Xi Jinping, and one of the first things he had to do, one of the million first obligations he had on taking office, was to have his daughter return from her enrollment as an undergraduate in Harvard and come back to China because it was embarrassing. And the fact that so much of the Chinese leadership has their money and their children in Western institutions as opposed to China, in the one sense, it's a recognition of the globalization of higher ed and all the rest, but also a sense of nervousness that we would feel if the children of our Supreme Court or congressional leaders or president were all being schooled in Japan right now or in China. It would be a sign. So on the fate of people and their families, there are mixed indications on this. For companies, I think at the moment it's a discouraging process or prognosis on whether the reform in the Chinese system is proceeding in a way that's going to allow China to take the next step towards real corporate wealth. There's so much energy, so much money, and so much just effort being poured in this. You can never underestimate what is possible there, but I keep looking at indications like the following. I'll mention 2 of them. One is I was interviewing in Shanghai about 3 or 4 months ago a very bright entrepreneur who had an idea for a whole new project, and he is incorporating his company for VC and copyright purposes in Menlo Park, California, because he thought there he could actually make a business of it and not in Shanghai, which is where he was from. Similarly, I was interviewing a couple of days ago some of the world's leading experts in new battery technology. These people were all from China, but they're all now doing their work at Stanford. And this is the question is when the institutions in China will make that possible for themselves. And I'll talk later on, if you want, about the implications of the internet for these possibilities of pollution, university structure, and all the rest. For the government, is the government likely to get what it wants in terms of staying in power? This is a very important question. My bet is yes, but let me tell you why this is not an all or nothing bet. Just 2 days ago, I was talking with a foreign ambassador who had returned from the previous 6 years of service in Beijing, and he was now back out of China, and he said he had shifted to believing that the Communist Party actually could not retain control, something that he said he had not thought when he began his service in Beijing. And he said that if you think of all the contradictions that have to be managed, from income inequality to pollution to foreign relations with Japan and Taiwan and the Koreas and all the rest, that it did not seem a solvable equation to him. Now, he said, as I agreed, that they thought the alternative would not be mass uprising a la the Middle East, or some strictly democratic movement because there's no other political party that's allowed to exist, but rather a faction within the Communist Party that essentially become the opposition. I think that's still the minority position, but this is a genuine question, as I think it wouldn't have seemed a couple of years ago. And here are the markers I will suggest for you that you keep track of over the years ahead. There are three people that represent three different strands of thinking about the government's hold. You can follow the three of them and see how this plays out. On the one hand is a man named Gordon Chang, who's been arguing for a long time that the collapse of China is just around the corner. His book, The Coming Collapse of China, I think was published in 2000, 2001. It's been in several revised editions. He says it's just a matter of time. So if you make a prediction with no timeline, no time horizon, it's a good way to make predictions. That's one extreme. The other extreme is a man named Eric X. Lee, L-I. He's from Shanghai. He worked for Ross Perot. He has a ranch in Sonoma, but he now is back in Shanghai saying the Chinese model is the model for the future. He's been arguing this in lots of articles, so you can follow him and see his argument saying that this actually is the right model for the long run. In the middle is a man named Min-Shin Pei, P-E-I, who's at Claremont McKenna, also from Shanghai originally, and he argues that the Chinese model was perfect for its time, but its time is reaching its end, and that it's not simply that one-party states haven't lasted longer than, say, 70 years in modern times, but also that the economic model, the constraints on public discourse and all the rest, they're reaching their limits. Those are three things you can watch. And again, watch the pollution readings above all. Those, I think, are the single most important barometer for whether things are getting better or worse. So my question two, are they likely to get it? Individuals are concerned. Companies are concerned. The government is basically in strong shape, but still there are a lot of challenges. The third question is, what does this mean if they get it or not? If the different parts of the Chinese system achieve what they want or don't, I think it's better for the rest of the world if China is on the whole successful than if it is on the whole not successful. This may seem strange if your view of life is zero-sum between China and the US, but I think a great part of US foreign policy since the time of Richard Nixon on through Barack Obama is that it more or less consistently has argued that the US is better off if China develops than if it does not. That it is, for all the problems and challenges a developing China brings, a impoverished, fractionated China would be worse. And so it's better to work with China, and the US does work with China in many more ways than are obvious. The reason I think this affects the open up or closing down question is that the less confident the Chinese leadership feels, the more closed it is going to become. And the main option for having a more open China, economically, politically, any other way you want, is a leadership that feels it can afford to be open. Let me first give you a contradictory example to that and then explain why I say it. The contradictory example is the modern reforms, of course, began 30 years ago under Deng Xiaoping. I was working for Jimmy Carter as a speechwriter at the time when these negotiations began, and got to see Deng Xiaoping, seeing Jimmy Carter in the White House. Jimmy Carter enjoyed this for many reasons. It was a great historic thing that he did. Deng Xiaoping was wearing a cowboy hat. Also, Deng Xiaoping was about a foot shorter than Jimmy Carter. So this was and Jimmy Carter was short as politicians go. So this was a great moment for him to see. But Deng Xiaoping, as the price of opening up economically, he clamped down politically. He knew that economic reform was going to be tumultuous, there'd be winners and losers, so there was a closing down politically as there was an opening up economically. The most optimistic case you could make for what's happening now is that Xi Jinping has something similar in mind, that all the ways in which he is closing down politically on the internet with his various rivals, even the anti-corruption drive, are signs of moving towards a more open and liberalized economy. We don't know. It's possible that it is a clamping down politically for good reasons. It's possible it's a clamping down for bad reasons. And we'll just have to watch the evidence and see how things go on. What would be, from the outside, it's easy to say, oh yes, if they just opened up in all ways, freed the internet, let more reporters come in, let universities work as they freely should, let people travel around the world, that would benefit them both economically and politically. It would be in their long-term interest. That's not how most governments think. And it's not how the Chinese government often thinks. And here is an illustration to bear in mind. Probably the most influential Westerners in China, when it comes to affecting the world's view of China, are the correspondents for the New York Times. And the foreigners in China who are most hassled by the Chinese government are those same correspondents for the New York Times. So if you were taking the long-term view, you would have a charm offensive for the most influential foreign journalists, but it's just the opposite approach. They're the ones who are called at 4 a.m. to be nagged at, who can't get their visas renewed and all the rest. So there is a defensive crouch and clutch for the Chinese government that at the moment makes it look as if they are closing down in many ways, and we can mainly hope that this is a strategic move for openness in the longer term, but no one can know that right now. To move now quickly and finally to my last point about what this means, what any of us can do about it. Again, I'll summarize where we've been so far. What do they want? They want things that anybody would want, but also a different economic plan. Are they going to get it? Maybe. It looks rocky. What does this mean for us? The closing down, apparently, at the moment is problematic in various ways. And what can we do about it? I think here there actually is, I've come to believe something by thinking about China these past 8 years now that I didn't believe when I started, and that I will try to convince you all of. Journalists are by nature a cynical and jaded and caustic view of humanity tribe. That's who we are. That's who comes into this line of work. You are interested in the world, but you are unsentimental about it. And so I have been generally skeptical of the idea that individual human person-to-person programs or goodwill measures or things like that really mattered in how the world operates. But when it comes to the US and China, I've come to think that it really makes a profound difference that so many people, like all of you, have been to to China and traveled around there, that so many people in China, if you go to some village out in some godforsaken province, their cousin is now studying at Michigan State or has been on a program someplace in Florida, that if you go to hospitals around China, many of them have had American or Western doctors or nurses come there and do volunteer work, that there has been such a network of human connections between the Chinese public in all of its diversity and all of its contradictions and their counterparts in the outside world, particularly the United States, that as a buffering force, when tensions arrive between the countries and for the long-term opening that is of benefit for China and the rest of the world, I think it actually does matter that businesses here have connections in China, that people here travel there, that you welcome students and temporary workers from China in communities like this. So I think that is worth doing and has a long-term effect. I'll say when it comes to America's role in China, there's a factor that I think is often underappreciated in the United States. Most of the time, when I've traveled around the world as an American, you spend 80% of your time explaining parts of American foreign policy that foreigners don't like. This is true in Europe, it's true in South Korea, it's true in Japan, it's true in most of the places you go, it's true in the Middle East. I spent less of my time doing that in China than most other places I've been because of all the places I've lived around the world. It's where the default attitude towards the United States is most benign, shading towards possibly positive compared to other places I've been. There was one horrible personal aspect of this for me, which I'll disclose to you before building to the big finish and the request. I'll heal anybody who wants to come down here too, which is that it's a known anthropological fact that across racial lines, people don't recognize facial divisions that much. If you see a very, very tall Chinese man, you might think, I wonder if that's Yao Ming. Or if you see, this is just a reality of life. People don't distinguish well in different racial groups. And so everybody in China, literally every single person, was convinced I actually was George W. Bush. And, and so I was often made to explain, what I was thinking and going into Iraq. After Bush left office, I had a lot of fun with this. I talked to taxi drivers about how Cheney was a lot more fun than he seemed to be, et cetera. But even in in a circumstance I would never have invited, of being taken for our nation's 43rd president, whatever number, was he 43? Taken as our nation's past president. Still, the reaction in China, there's potential in China for a basically neutral to positive view of the United States that we can work with. And so there's a lot more I could say on any of these, but let me just wrap up to say that as you follow the news in China next week, next year, 5 years from now, and see signs about the environment and about corporate development and about housing prices and about migration, I think apply this model to them of what the different components of that society are looking for, whether they're getting it, and whether the answer to that problem, how it affects us, and whether it's making the society more open or more closed. I remain, at this moment, I think the auguries are slightly more negative than positive for the near-term future in China, but there is so much human energy and idealism there that I can never count it out. So that's my overview of how to think about the news coming out of China. Now I'll be happy to answer any questions, complaints about China, America, or the trip we're making around the country. So thanks for having me here.
We're going to be, oh, I don't have the mic on. Is the mic on? We're going to be taking text questions.
Oh, good.
But I do have a question for you.
Yes.
In your book, China Airborne, you use the analogy of the aerospace industry. Could you touch on that lightly? Just give us a little
Yes.
tickler about the book.
So here's the background point here is even though this is becoming a really difficult time to work as a journalist in China, the last time I went a couple months ago, I basically couldn't get a visa until just the day before my flight was supposed to go. And this was for a meeting organized in Beijing by the Communist Party University, and I couldn't get a visa to go to that. So even though it's becoming a hard time to work as a journalist, it's the golden age of nonfiction about China. There are books coming out every day about China. Some of them are overviews, like Orville Schell and John Delury have a great recent book called Wealth and Power, sort of talking about China's desire to retain its standing in the world. But many of them are looking at the microcosm, saying, here is one little part of Chinese life and what you draw from that. For example, a wonderful book called Foreign Babes in Beijing, about a young woman who became a soap opera actress in China, a young American woman. Or Mr. China, about a guy who was selling auto parts in China. And so the approach I took, some of my Atlantic articles were the big pictures, some were the microcosm. This book was saying, if the real struggle for China is going from a big workhouse to a modern economy, there are a couple of industries that will be bellwethers for that. Infotech, pharma, university structure, and aerospace. These are all industries that exist, that if they exist, there's a lot else you know by their existence. You know something about copyright law. You know something about environmental standards and all the rest. And so I focused on aerospace because for odd reasons I'd ended up, I'm a pilot and I ended up knowing about the aviation community inside China, which is a fascinating combination at the same time of the Wright brothers and Charles Lindbergh and Neil Armstrong and the TSA agents, and everything is happening all at one time in China. And the reason that their success matters, they're trying to develop their own competitor to Boeing and Airbus. And remember, Boeing is America's leading exporter and a manufactured exporter. They're trying to develop their own, they're building 100 airports, 100 new airports around the country to try to improve the transportation infrastructure. They're trying to develop their own biofuels industry so they can run all these new jets on a carbon neutral basis. And they're trying to develop a sort of business aviation industry because there's so little of that now. And so this struggle seemed to me a test for anything you wanted to see about China's situation has its analog. Plus it was just incredibly interesting to see the characters who are trying to pull this off. For example, the man who is, I I was working as a ferry pilot one time in China on a flight that I barely survived. Spoiler, I did. And when I was taking off from this airport in Changsha, I noticed just before we disappeared into the murk, there was a full-scale replica of the Great Pyramid of Egypt to one side, made out of golden glass. So it made me think, what is this? So I went back to see this guy. He's an aerospace pioneer too. So that's why, that's the theme, the story I'm trying to tell of China through its aerospace ambitions.
Okay. We have a lot of text questions that are coming in, which is great.
I will be more terse.
The first one would be, could you speak to the domestic political drivers of territorial conflicts in the South China Sea and with Japan and South Korea?
Yes. I think the United States is used to thinking that the Beijing, Taipei, People's Republic, Republic of China tension is the main strategic issue in that area. But I think that actually is the least troublesome one now. That, of course, there are protests underway in Taiwan, and I'll put that aside for the moment. I think there are two drivers that are significant here, one inside China and one in Japan. The inside China one is if you go back to 2008, 2009, we were living in Beijing then. It was just after the Olympics, and it was a time of, you recall, tremendous trauma in the world economy and the US economy. People in Michigan know about that very well. In Beijing, the side of that we saw is we had an apartment overlooking a long-distance bus terminal. So every day we'd see thousands of these migrant workers with their weather-beaten skin and their giant bags full of their possessions, going on buses back to their home provinces because they'd lost their jobs in the city. So you had this real contraction of the Chinese economy, and it was, number one, blamed on the US appropriately, and number two, China recovered from it more quickly than the US did. If you went into the countryside, you saw those same migrant workers building roads or dams a month or two later. And so that led to a kind of overconfidence in a lot of the Chinese establishment for the next year or so, which I think was part of a sort of expansionist itch in the South China Sea by the People's Liberation Army Navy, which was trying to sort of assert some of its rights in the South China Sea. That provoked a backlash essentially from all other nations, from South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Singapore, Australia, Vietnam, and all the rest. They were sort of congealing and asking the United States to reassert itself there, which it did. I think that is a somewhat stable situation now. I think the Japan-China situation is not stable and is dangerous. The background here is on the Japanese side. I think the country does not do a good job of teaching its World War II history. We lived there for a long time. My kids went to Japanese public school. What they learned about the history from 1937 to 1945 essentially was the atomic bomb. That was really all that happened then, and Japan was the victim. So Japan is, many of its people are not aware of the bitterness within China. On China's side, the government just relentlessly cranks up anti-Japanese propaganda all the time. And I think this has left each side feeling sort of aggrieved at the other, and you have the dispute over the islands. The Japanese sort of took the first recent step, the Chinese retaliated, and so domestic politics in both countries have been nationalistic, and the US is in a bind as Japan's treaty ally to try to stamp this down. That's my staccato response to that.
I think we have a question
Yes.
from the audience.
Two questions, if I might. China's economic growth and their engine has primarily been low wages over the last number of years. With wages going up, jobs coming back from China, and even China starting to outsource, how is that going to affect their economic growth? My second one, I noticed on your bio you had worked for Microsoft, and I wonder if you could comment on intellectual property rights with respect to China.
Yes, so starting in the reverse, I think the intellectual property rights is part of this shift to being a rich country as opposed just to a big workhouse country, and then the question for their future, because if you look at the traits of countries that are rich now, whether it's in Asia or Western Europe or any place in Europe or the US, there's a number of traits they have in common, including rule of law and intellectual property protection. And because if you don't have that, it's a problem in the short term for Microsoft. They figure that 20% of their user base is in China and 1% of their sales base is in China. And that's a problem for Microsoft in the short term. It's a worse problem for Chinese companies because they know that they can't develop these higher end things because they will be pirated themselves. So the the U.S. has been properly pushing both its own interest and trying to ally with Chinese entrepreneurs to say your future depends on having these things protected. So I think that is a long-term effort that will eventually prevail. On the low-wage issue, the rise of Chinese wages is a good thing objectively for people in China. It means they're moving up. I was at the giant Foxconn factory about a year ago, and the owner there is trying to learn from Henry Ford's maxim of paying people enough that they can buy your own products. I think that would not necessarily be a brake on their growth, because it hasn't been for Japan or South Korea or others. The brake on their growth is that the economic model has been skewed in the opposite way from America's a few years ago. America's a few years ago was have this bubble of real estate prices that people would use to borrow and buy things, and that was the model for growth. And obviously we are working our way out of that. The Chinese model has been build more infrastructure and build more factories and employ people, even though you're not sure where you're going to sell this or where the money is going to be repaid from. So you have 100 airports being built, you have overcapacity in everything, and that, I think, is the imbalance. That's the greater problem to work their way out of than the wages. One other point, China's workforce is actually shrinking because of the one-child policy. So it's okay from their point of view if the wages go up. That's not the real problem. It's more trying to shift to a domestic consumption model that's more their challenge. Yes, sir.
First, thank you for coming to West Michigan. I've been
My pleasure.
following your work for, 15, 20 years. I always find it entertaining,
Thank you.
engaging, and insightful, so thank
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about energy generation and pollution, since one of the many responses from people in the U.S. that don't want to deal with global climate change is that why bother in the U.S. because China's building all these plants and they're polluting the world, and what we do doesn't matter?
That's a good question, and it's so. Again, I'll say that how many people here have been to Beijing on a bad air day? So it is. I grew up in Southern California during the era of smog, and there were occasional days that were bad. But it is something that even the government can no longer deny, and it's just becoming a public health epidemic. And the government published a couple of years ago, or last year, figures showing that the average person in Beijing has a 5-year reduction in his or her life expectancy because of air quality, which is that is a phenomenal sort of public health thing to admit. Anyhow, the government recognizes this. So point one is China has tremendous pollution problems and CO2 problems that are getting worse. Point two is their government is trying a lot harder than our government is to deal with them. And there are no climate denialists in the Chinese government. They are, that every sort of research for sustainable energy is going on further there. Their economy is simultaneously more wasteful than ours in energy terms in a per GDP basis. Buildings are worse insulated, factories are less efficient, and much less wasteful on a per capita basis. There's individual less consumption. So their government is trying hard. Point three is that the hope or the despair of climate efforts will basically be whether the U.S. and China can work together on this or not. For example, Wired has a cover story just now about why coal is going to be burned for the foreseeable future, especially in China, so it has to become cleaner. I had a cover story in the Atlantic 3 years ago to the same effect. And this is where U.S. and China energy departments and companies and researchers are the key to having us survive or not collectively. So I think the answer to those people is that the only hope for China not killing itself and everybody else is it's working very closely with U.S. institutions and U.S. scientists, and the only hope for that is the U.S. being able to do that on our side. And about a year ago, there was an insane obstacle to this when the House passed a bill prohibiting certain U.S. scientific bodies from doing any cooperation with China, just because it was, this didn't last, but it was it was an obstacle while it was underway. So this is a problem for Chinese people and for everybody else, and the main hope is U.S. and Chinese interaction.
We have so many, I don't know where to begin. What do you think about China's investment activities in Africa? And do you feel they're grabbing valuable resources?
There's a great book coming out soon by my friend Howard French. I forget its exact title, something like China's Second Continent or something like that, but it's about exactly this point. And so if you ask Chinese people there, they'd say, yeah, we're grabbing up these resources as if the U.S. and Europe have never done such things. They say this is colonialism without the actual warboats or gunboats and all the rest. They're saying they're grabbing up the resources after the U.S. has already locked up the Middle East and the other places. So yes, China is having its own non-militarized form of colonialism in Africa, which has had a generally poor reaction in Africa and in parts of Latin America because it's largely been in conjunction with local leaders and the Chinese style of crony capitalism, where you are dealing in the local plutocrats on your project. That's been good for the local governments, but not so good often for the local people. Often the workforces and the contracting companies have been Chinese too. So I think Chinese would say, who is anybody in the Western world to complain about this because the U.S. has done things like this? And it's getting a fair amount of backlash in Africa and South America too.
Of course, it's going to be the Atlantic, but aside from the Atlantic, what's the most authoritative, up-to-date source for news from China?
There's a huge abundance of online. It's a golden age for news from China. So I think if you look at the sites and the coverage from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and even poor Bloomberg, which we can talk about if you want, and the Asia Society has a site called China File, a site called the China Real-Time Blog, I guess run by Wall Street Journal. If you start getting into the tentacles of the China diaspora on the web, you will never come out. It's just so much good stuff. So I think go to the Asia Society's China File site and branch out from there, and you'll see 100 sites. There's a tremendous wealth of material, including by people who are Westerners and others writing dispatches in English from China, from every little town in China. So there's no excuse not to find this stuff. And the Atlantic.
Of course. How would you compare corruption in China, especially in the government, with other major countries?
When I was living in Japan and Malaysia in the 1980s and traveling to the Philippines and Burma and Indonesia, I came to believe in the distinction between efficient and inefficient corruption. Efficient corruption is Japan. And here's what I mean. When we were living in Japan in the mid-80s, there was a guy who was sort of the equivalent of Reince Priebus or Karl Rove, a big party boss, a guy named Shin Kanemaru. And they found him at one point in his house, under his bed. He had gold bars worth $50 million. This made people think there might have been some corruption involved in party politics in Japan. But it was efficient corruption because the Japanese economy was still going and everybody knew that people were dealt in. But it was like Chicago or New York or parts of the U.S. quasi-corrupt political system where things still got done. You had, on the other hand, inefficient corruption like Indonesia under Suharto or the Philippines under Marcos, where so much was being bled away by a small number of people that just didn't work. The question in China is whether it's crossing the line from efficient to inefficient corruption. It has not been, in my experience, corrupt in the retail way. You don't have to bribe people for every little thing, as used to be the case in Indonesia. And clearly it is corrupt on a larger level, where local governors and mayors are in on all the big real estate projects, and essentially the families of the leading communist officials are all billionaire families. So with this latest revelation in the last day or so of a former member of the highest governing body and 100 of his family members being rounded up for $14 billion worth of corrupt, 14 billion of corrupt holdings, whether we are seeing what either is inefficient corruption or will be seen as such by the public. And the dilemma here to bear in mind is one camp of people says the current government has to crack down on corruption because everybody knows it's going on, and this will be a sign of seriousness. The other camp says if he cracks down on corruption, people will say, what the hell, $14 billion? How did this happen? And it will be a further kind of instability and will undermine the government. So I think it's corrupt. I have assumed it to be efficiently corrupt, and the question is whether it's becoming inefficiently corrupt, and we'll see. And same question about the U.S.
You mentioned that corporations are not sprouting up in a large fashion in China, nor are large corporations keeping their wealth in China. How much of this do you attribute to the Chinese culture?
I am both an appreciator of and skeptic of cultural explanations. On the one hand, culture is powerful. When we lived in Japan, there are certain aspects of Japanese culture that matter, et cetera, but I think most of the factors in China's current situation I attribute to institutions as opposed to culture. For example, people say, oh, that Chinese students are not creative because of Confucian culture. These same people, when they get to Stanford or the Sorbonne or someplace else, are perfectly creative, and in institutions that reward different kinds of work. So I view the situation in China as mainly institutional rather than cultural because Taiwan has its own very successful corporations, it has intellectual property protection, it has fractious democracy and all the rest. The scale is different from mainland China. So I think I give first place to institutions, even though recognizing the power of culture. There's a quote, I think this is a Daniel Patrick Moynihan quote from the olden days saying something like, this is an approximation, the great conservative insight is that culture is tremendously powerful. The great liberal insight is that institutions can affect culture. I think both those things are true.
Do you think that the U.S. and Chinese economies are fully codependent, and as a result, is it not a strong stabilizing factor?
Yes and yes. I think that when I was living in Japan in the 1980s during Japan's rise, I felt there was actually a real challenge to the U.S. economy because it was head-to-head competition, Toyota and GM, Toshiba and IBM, et cetera. China's is a much more complementary relationship, which is globalization as a whole has been disruptive for workforces around the world. But I think for the overall economy, it's been largely a codependent relationship, and that is, it's better than for all of the problems than a real showdown type relationship in terms of buffering the differences.
We've received a couple questions about Crimea and Russia. Can you address the Chinese perspective on that issue?
If the question were going to be about Crimea and Russia, I was going to roll out my old, I don't know enough about this to say anything at all response. So that's when it comes to Crimea and Russia. China's view of it is, it's worth bearing in mind about their foreign policy. For both principled reasons and convenience, it's been the standard line from China during the communist era has been, we believe in non-intervention. You don't tell us how to do things in our territory, including Tibet, Taiwan as they see it, Xinjiang and the rest. We're not going to mess with you. And that's why they can say, well, we're going to do business in Darfur, we're going to do business with tyrants, we don't care, we just deal with it, we don't interfere with other countries. I think they are being pushed towards a different view from that by reasons of their scale. And I guess this will be an awkward situation for them because they don't like what Russia has done. It seems more aggressive, but they'd like to have a better relationship with Russia sort of as a balanced wheel to the United States. So I think, I don't know that I've heard anything from China on this topic, and they're probably thinking what's the least awkward response on their side. But I think they will not be a leading part of an international reaction against Russia.
Given the current political economy, and we're going back again about 2 questions ago to add to that, given the current political economy and the government's communist operative framework, do you personally believe corporate enterprise can in reality be achieved in China's economy given the decentralized structure and a lack of local government legitimacy, specifically in the rural areas?
Many aspects to that. I'll address just 2 or 3 of them. I think although it is the Communist Party, it's Communist Party of China is in charge, it's a communist republic, that has essentially zero relevance in daily life of any sort. The joke in Beijing is that there was exactly one communist in China, and that was the Cuban ambassador to China. That there are all these Marxist newspapers that talk about how Marx would view the latest Lamborghini factory and why he would approve of it. But I think that communist is just the label for what is the existing regime. I think that I think there's no communist impediment to having a successful corporate structure there. The governing situation of China actually should promote rather than retard corporate growth because it's much more strangely decentralized than American systems are. There are certain things where the central government can get its way like that, whether it's internet censorship or other things, but a lot of the rest, including economic development, is very, very balkanized. So I think that the local situation is one I don't know well enough really to say much more than that about. But I guess my point is it shouldn't be the case that the governing structure there is an impediment. It's more the constraints on the emergence of civil society, free discussion, political accountability, and the rest that's holding them back, I think.
And I think we'll take one last question and let this gentleman ask.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again for joining
Thank
us here. I recently just returned from China, and I travel a lot between Hong Kong and China. What, if any, influence or role do you see Hong Kong playing in the Chinese future, and what influence, if any, do you think they actually have on Chinese politics and whatnot?
An interesting question. I think their effect on mainland politics is minimal, as far as I've been able to see. But I think they can play an important role in the emerging China, even after the 50-year clock runs out and they're more directly under mainland control. Because I think the leaders when you go from the mainland to Hong Kong, as any of you who've done it realize, it's really a palpable difference. It ranges from things like traffic obeys stop signs and all that, to the fact that there is actual rule of law and the free press and everything. And I think the leaders in Beijing recognize the advantage it gives them to have something that's part of their country that operates by international standards. And so, for example, international financial companies recognize there's certain sorts of treatment they can expect in Hong Kong they wouldn't be as confident of in Shanghai or Beijing. And so I think that as long as there's not a frontal challenge to Beijing's authority, either in Hong Kong or in different ways from Taiwan, the reality of having a different system running on international standards in Hong Kong is a plus for the entire Chinese system. So I think that if that can remain, it's in the interest of both sides to have something that's within China but genuinely a separate system where the rest of the world can think, okay, things work here by world rules and not by Chinese rules. The internet in Hong Kong's airport is the real internet. The internet right across the border is not the real internet. And so as long as that can last, I think it's in everybody's interest. So thank you all. It's an honor to be back here in Western Michigan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Fallows, for sharing with us your insights into China's current development and your suggestion how we can observe China's future development. We have learned a great deal tonight, and we are again reminded of the importance of U.S.-China relations. As a small token of our appreciation, we have prepared a very special gift. I wanted to show all the audience here. This is a pen with a stylus tip made with Michigan bird's eye maple.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'll say, I have 2 other things to say. I'm very grateful for this. I'm planning also this evening to have some of Michigan's fine beer as part of my gift. And if anybody wants to be healed up here on the podium, I'll do that.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, this is our final Great Decision program. Thank you all for coming. And as always, we continue to have very intriguing and inspiring programs for you.